What a year it's been. So much has happened, I couldn't possibly fit it all into one end-of-year monologue. I've had to watch back my monologues. Some of them were better than others, more prescient than others, though some of them were pulverizingly powerful. And if only those who are actually powerful would watch them, well, they might have a better idea of how to get out of the mess we are in. The highlights or lowlights of the year are obvious if you're in Britain. I would have to Google to check who and what and how many ministers Britain has had in the course of 2022. We've had 3 prime ministers, I'm not making that up, 3 prime ministers in the course of 2022, but we've also had multiple foreign ministers, home ministers, that's the Ministry of the Interior in countries that don't lie. It is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister. We have actually had so many that even someone with the elephantine memory and grasp of political events like me could not possibly adumbrate them all at once to you without reading them out. Indeed, most of them are not worth reading out, although they'll be getting a pension as the former minister of this or that, even if they literally only spent a single day in the job, as some of them actually did. Only a day in the job, paid forevermore, as the former Minister for Paper Clips in the British government. It has been the omni-shambles, the cluster you know what. And it isn't over yet. As I speak at the end of 2022, no one has actually seen the British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, for many weeks. Now, a charitable interpretation of that is that he's burning the midnight oil, coming up with a cunning plan to get us out of the difficulties we're in, or even trying to find some midnight oil in order to burn, because, of course, Britain is in the grip of the deepest of freezes, and the economic consequences of that will be being felt next Christmas, when, God willing, I speak to you again. Rishi Sunak, I say it again, Rashid Sunak, as Joe Biden called him on the day that he was elected. I say elected loosely because, of course, nobody stood against him, and he was picked only by a tiny handful of Conservative members of Parliament who had defenestrated 2 of his predecessors over almost as few months. Boris Johnson looked to be the king of all he surveyed when he won an 80-seat Conservative majority in the late bleak midwinter of 2019. Now he's left with his tail between his legs, but his bank balance considerably enhanced. As we reached the end of 2022, Boris Johnson recorded, as he must in the parliamentary records, that he had earned £1,025,000, that's a lot more in dollars, for speaking to audiences around the world in just the few months since he ceased to be Prime Minister. No wonder he wasn't in any hurry to come back. He's going to be a multi-millionaire by the end of all this, which is just as well, as he has multiple alimony and an uncounted number of children to pay for. There was then an interregnum. It will be remembered, if at all, as a comic opera episode when someone called Liz Truss wandered into Downing Street, bemused and bewildered, to find that she was the new Prime Minister, but not for long. So puerile, pitiful, so stupid, doltish was Liz Truss that even her own stupid colleagues, and the Conservatives have long been known as the stupid party, discovered that with her they were all going down the tubes. Others, of course, had never accepted her, as they had never accepted Boris Johnson's replacement. they had a kind of indefatigable desire to turn back to the one true blue faith, which for many of them is the star that never died, called Margaret Thatcher. For others, it's the effervescent star of Boris Johnson, but for the majority of Conservative members of Parliament, it was the diminutive billionaire Rishi Sunak. I say billionaire, he's only worth actually a few hundred million himself, but his wife is worth more than $1 billion. So as a power couple, if she ever comes back to the country, she's offshore dodging tax at the moment, then the two of them together are the richest occupants of Downing Street in the entire history of the British state. Good luck to them, as long as they didn't commit any crimes in making their money. But I have my doubts that Rishi Sunak has any idea what life is currently like on a housing estate in industrial or post-industrial Britain in sub-zero temperatures for families that literally cannot afford to heat their homes. He's never gone hungry. He's never been cold. He has never been worried about where the next paycheck is coming from. He is a man with a green card, ready, like Boris perhaps, to flee to the United States when the inevitable happens. And the Conservatives, in power since 2010, finally hit the rocks. How lucky are we that if that happens, Rishi Sunak will probably be replaced by somebody called Sir Keir Starmer, who's even worse. And if you've never seen him, what a treat you have got in store. So the collapsing British government was, for me, living in Britain, the #1 story of the year. But of course, the backdrop to all of this has been the war in Ukraine, which drags on, I'm afraid, and will still be on next Christmas at this time, I wholeheartedly predict to you. Unless, of course, there is an uprising in Kiev and the people of Ukraine realize finally that they have been taken for a very, very expensive ride. Expensive in blood and treasure. Ursula von der Leyen, the chief of the European Union, underestimated when she said unguardedly in December that the Ukrainian armed forces had lost more than 100,000 men dead. That would mean, of course, on the normal military ratio, 200,000 to 300,000 wounded, maimed, disabled, crippled, on top of those who were dead. But many people, including the great Scott Ritter, believed that she was seriously undercounting. And of course, since von der Leyen spoke, the battles around Bakhmut and elsewhere are now impacting even in the pro-war press in Britain as military disasters for Ukraine. In Bakhmut, it's estimated that 10,000 men are already dead, and the battle is still not over. 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers in a single battle for a town that you have never heard of, couldn't spell, and probably can't pronounce. The war has been a catastrophe for the people of Ukraine. It has been quite a burden for the people of Russia also. But the second biggest victim of this war has been the population of Europe, without a doubt. Of course, the Ukrainians have lost the blood, but we in the rest of Europe have lost the treasure. The treasure in the scores of billions that we have sent to the Zelensky regime in Kiev, the treasure that we've lost through our collapsing economy and our entirely self-harming raft of sanctions that we imposed to punish Russia. It's a weird kind of punishment where the person meting it out feels the pain and the person on the receiving end of it makes the gain. The ruble is the best performing currency of 2022. The Russian economy is booming. Every order they lost in the West, they've made up for in the East. In fact, a lot of what they're selling to the East is ending up at an inflated price in the West in any case. Of all the European economies to suffer the impact of the self-harming sanctions that Western leaders have introduced, Germany is, of course, the biggest loser. The German government's jacket hangs on a very shaky nail in the Chancery in Berlin. The truth is that Germany had made itself over-dependent on Russian gas. You can see why they did so. There had never been the slightest interruption on political grounds in the supply. The price was low, certainly by comparison with the American LPG that they are now having to buy. LPG, LNG now have to come in on floating terminals, which have to be paid for by the customer, and the environmental impact of the American imports, not to mention the price, 4 times the price they were paying for Russia, has literally devastated the German economy. Germany became too dependent on Russian gas, to be sure, but equally too dependent on hordes of cheap labour brought in from the East in either economic migrant terms or in terms of political refugees. Angela Merkel literally allowed millions of refugees and economic migrants into Germany, and now there's nowhere for them to work. They're all dressed up in German clothes in German cities with nowhere to go. Certainly no factories, because the factories are closing down, many of them being unbolted from the floor and shipped to the United States of America, and their key workers being given green cards to follow the factory and go and live and work in the United States. Now, this is a very combustible mixture, is it not? Knowing, as you must, the history of Germany. Economic collapse, the existence in the country of millions of potential scapegoats, a rising tide of hatred of the political class of the German establishment, a weak leader in little soldier Schulz and his crutch, the German Green Party that care about the environment so much they could not be more gung-ho for weapons and war. The mixture in Germany is now so toxic that I fear that political catastrophe in Germany is looming in 2023. And if it is, we of course will be monitoring it very closely on the mother of all talk shows. But it's not just Germany. In Britain, as I said earlier, people's electricity and gas bills have multiplied, doubled, tripled, or in our household case, quadrupled. Businesses, small and medium size, simply cannot afford to pay their energy bills and are closing their doors. Even big companies, if you think about it, cannot possibly have budgeted for a tripling or a quadrupling of their energy costs. Certainly, the rising unemployment and underemployment, short-time working and wage cuts that the British working people are suffering is an indicator that this, of course, has not yet run its course. The British working class is up in arms, out on the stones in their millions. Railway workers, postal workers, National Health Service workers, workers of all kinds, rejecting the savage wage cuts that their employers are demanding of them. Because, of course, a wage increase of 4% when inflation is at 12% and rising is an 8% and rising cut in your wages. One of my neighbours got a wage increase in 2022 of 1% in a country where inflation is more than 10 times that. You don't have to be Einstein to do the maths about how people's living standards are being slashed. Of course, the British working class are not the most militant. That label belongs to the French in Europe. and it remains to be seen how little Napoleon, President Macron, can stay atop a collapsing economic situation in France when the French people have been militant on the streets with the cobblestones in their hands for centuries. So the North American economy is not yet in the parlous state of the Europeans, but the alliance between the United States and Europe is becoming precarious because an increasing number of people in Europe realize that it was the United States that dragged us into this. The third biggest story for me of 2022 is the highly visible cognitive decline of the American President Joe Biden, almost like a metaphor of American decline, shitting itself in the Vatican, soiling itself in the corridors of the White House, unable to remember where it is, what it's doing there, and what its purpose originally was. The United States is in a very bad political place right now. Not only have they completely failed in their declared task of confronting, dividing, weakening, and if possible, regime changing the Russian Federation, the Chinese economy is passing them by on the inside track and at quite a rate. China doesn't like to boast about its prospects of becoming the world's largest economy. So let me boast for them. I'm saying to you that by the end of 2023, at worst by the middle of 2024, the Chinese will be the biggest economy in the world. China is already lifted 800 million people out of poverty, and the average Chinese family are now richer than the average European family. Just think about that. When I was young, my mother used to tell me to eat up. They were starving in China. Actually, there's people starving but for charity and food banks here in Britain today. But back to Joe Biden as he wandered around stage after stage after stage, flustered, lost, as he misspoke, misstated, misread autocue after autocue, as he embarrassed hosts like the Pope and others with his unscheduled toilet breaks all over the world. At one point, he almost walked off the end of a pier at a meeting in England. He turned the wrong way and began to walk towards the sea. Luckily, his good wife was there to save him, or maybe not so luckily. Joe Biden is, of course, an embarrassment. Kamala Harris, even more so. And the looming presence of Donald Trump, waiting in the wings to do what only one president before him has ever done, to come back for a second term. That'll be the big story of 2023. Can Joe make it to the finishing line? Is he seriously expecting to run and win again? And if he did, at the age of 82 and not quite in control of his faculty or his bowels, what would that tell us about the state of the divided United States? So many other stories. The World Cup in Qatar, such an outstanding success. The victories for people like Lula in Brazil and the contesting of those victories by an unrepentant and unforgiving right wing. The overthrow of the president of Peru. The jailing on bogus grounds of the vice president of Argentina. The continued strength, though, of left-wing forces in many Latin American countries like Mexico and like Colombia, which, to the astonishment of many, including me, now has a former guerrilla fighter as its president and has kissed and made up with Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. Speaking of him, whatever happened to Juan Guaido? the guy we gave all the gold, and claimed he was the president. Much more, of course, coming up on the mother of all talk shows twice weekly. From next week, we'll be on Sundays and Wednesdays every single week. God willing.